scalable graph algorithms.
Yes, so thank you for having me, and I apologize for being between lunch, but I will try to make this mildly quick. So I'm going to talk about my thesis work, and this thesis work sort of focused on trying to answer the following question. How are we going to take the advances that we've developed in parallel hardware and apply them to sort of the massive structured machine learning problems that we'd like to be able to solve? And so during my thesis as a PhD student, I was enabled to re-envision the entire stack, to sort of think not only about the algorithms, but the systems to support them as well. So we developed a new stack to address these problems. And sort of at the top level of the stack, we use graphical models as a standard representation of the sort of structured problems we'd like to solve in machine learning. And then below that, we developed new parallel algorithms for distributed inference on these models. And then to support those algorithms, we were able to develop a new system called GraphLab, which is a graph-parallel system for doing computation of the algorithms that we described here. So today I want to talk about the algorithms, their sort of underlying structure, and how that motivated the design of a sort of new system to approach graph computation that's slightly different than what's been talked about today. All right, so graphical models are a kind of a useful primitive for us to build these algorithms on top of, because they sort of provide a standard representation for each of our problems. So ranging from like problems from protein structure prediction, computer vision, to machine translation, all of these problems have a graphical representation. So I can sort of divorce myself from focusing on the problem-specific nature and encode that in a graph, and then design sort of generic algorithms that I can apply to those graphs to do inference. And so today I'm going to talk about two vignettes, two particular algorithms that we studied, and sort of the properties of those algorithms that motivated the design of the system. Okay, so I'm going to look at belief propagation, or loopy belief propagation, and Gibbs sampling. Okay? All right, so loopy belief propagation is a pretty common algorithm for graphical model inference. And it's an iterative algorithm in which, for each variable, I'm going to try to estimate sort of marginal beliefs about the distribution or the posterior distribution for those variables. And so if I take the center variable here, the reddish color circle around it, I begin by reading messages. So the belief propagation algorithm is an iterative algorithm in which I read messages from my neighboring vertices. I use those messages to estimate my new belief, so my new marginal. And then using that new marginal, I'm going to compute new messages to my neighboring vertices. They'll receive those messages, update their beliefs, and the process will repeat. Okay? Now, this seems like an embarrassingly parallel algorithm. In fact, many have studied this problem and said, look, we can make a very parallel version of this algorithm by assigning processors to our vertices. So if I assign a processor or a virtual processor to each of my vertices, then I can execute this algorithm entirely in parallel. Right? So each vertex is going to begin by receiving the messages from the neighboring vertices, computing a new belief, and then based on those beliefs, sending new messages to the neighboring vertices. Okay? So it's an iterative process, and it's proposed by many people. Okay, so that's a parallel algorithm. We might stop there and say, look, we've got a very parallel way to solve this inference problem. But we started to think about, is this an efficient way to solve this problem? So I have lots of cores, but I want to also be relatively efficient in my approach to solving a parallel problem. So we could ask the question, is synchronous loopy belief propagation an efficient parallel algorithm? Okay. So the way we sort of approach this problem is we want to step back and say, what is the structure, the sequential structure of inference in these models? So you have a big loopy graph, or a medium-sized loopy graph. And I'd like to sort of reason about the underlying sequential problem. I can cast that as sort of a sequence of strongly connected variables that might be embedded in my underlying model. Right? And I want to reason about how does the algorithm I just described, the very parallel algorithm, perform on this sequence of variables. We'll call this a chain graphical model. And so if I take this chain and just focus on these variables, I can think about what happens when I try to run inference on just this subproblem. Right? So what I can do is, let's suppose I introduce evidence. I make some observations about the variables at either end of the chain. Maybe the variable one end is very likely green, and the other variable at the other end is red. And you can tell them apart. Great. OK, so now I'm going to run this synchronous algorithm, bulk synchronous parallel algorithm, to compute all of these messages in parallel. Right? So at once, I'm going to compute, I have n variables in my chain. I'm going to compute 2n message calculations. But I have p processors, I have p physical processors. So the running time of that one iteration is just 2n over p. Okay? But as you might have noticed, evidence only moved one step. Right? So the green evidence moved one variable from the left, and the red evidence, from the right. And the red evidence moved one variable to the right. Okay, so if I repeat this another iteration, my evidence moves one variable at a time. And so it'll take n iterations of this process for the evidence to move across the graph. Okay? So the running time of this final algorithm is 2n squared over p, right? So for n iterations, and each running time 2n over p. So we might stop there and say, wow, that's a very parallel algorithm. It has has perfect scaling. But how does this perform compared to the best serial algorithm I could construct for this simple model? Right? So we can go back and say the natural and the obvious algorithm for solving this problem serially on one processor is to use a forward-backward algorithm in which we pass messages forward and then backward. And this has running time 2n. So unless we're willing to buy n processors, we're actually better off just running, for this chain, the serial algorithm. It's more efficient. Right? Now we could go, all right, now that we've focused on this chain, what's the best algorithm we could propose for inference in this message passing pattern? And so the best algorithm we can use for loopy belief propagation on this chain is to run messages in parallel in the forward and backwards directions. So that gives us a running time for inference in just this little chain of n. So we can be optimal using just 2 processors and getting a running time of n. Now, unless we introduce additional approximations, we're sort of constrained at this point for message passing belief propagation style algorithms. But in reality, a lot of the models we have sort of contractive potentials, or they have, we introduce sort of numerical approximation in our execution. Right? And so the way we can think about that is we return to our chain, and we think about the sequences of messages passed along this chain as a sequence of distributions. We could try to reason about what happens if we just cut the chain. So if we cut the chain from 3 to 4 and instead inject this uniform message, and we pass this uniform message along the chain, what happens? So for a lot of models, we have this contractive structure, where even though we've injected a noisy message into 4, that message ends up looking at the end like the message having passed along the entire chain. So this sort of shorter distance in which we get an epsilon level approximation, we call the tau epsilon distance. Right? So this is a theoretical construct that lets us reason about the parameters' effect on the underlying structure. Okay? And this is going to encode the sort of minimal sequential subproblem that we need to reason about for these chains. Now, with that idea in mind, we can now propose an algorithm that's going to be efficient for this chain that's going to exploit this tau epsilon structure. The algorithm is actually very simple. We just divide the chain evenly across our processors, and then within each of these processor blocks, we run the forward-backward algorithm from the exterior of the block to the root, and then from the root back to the exterior. Right? Then we exchange messages across processors, and then again repeat this process. Okay? And now we were able to show that this particular algorithm on this chain model has running time n over p plus tau epsilon. Right? So I have n variables, p processors, and tau epsilon becomes my sequential component. So this nicely breaks the problem into a parallel component, the n over p, and tau epsilon sequential component. Now, if we restrict our attention to these chains, we can actually show that this is also the optimal algorithm for this type of model. Okay? So now we've just sort of described a motif that really focuses on chains, but we really, in the first place, wanted to solve inference in much larger loopy models. And the way we can do that is take this sort of pattern and generalize it. And the way we did that is we introduced a splash operation. So this is a fundamental building block on which you could build other parallel algorithms on the graphs. And so the way this works is, as before in the chain, we nominate some vertex to be our center. And then we're going to build a breadth-first search spanning tree around that vertex. And now, having constructed that tree, we're going to move messages along the tree from the root, or from the leaves to the root, and then back from the root to the leaves. Right? So using this pattern on this tree, we're able to more efficiently solve the inference problem on this tree substructure. And so we're going to take this sort of chain optimal technique, apply it to loopy graphs, and then be able to generalize it as a distributed primitive. So if we take our large graph, we can take this little kernel, this breadth-first search spanning tree. We split our graph across processors, and then run these little splash operations on each machine, just as before, communicating messages across the partition. Right, so this is a primitive for building graph algorithms, or graphical model inference algorithms on these distributed graphs. And one of the things we found in our work in doing these inference algorithms is the need for prioritization. So I didn't mention this a little bit earlier. In many cases, we have some notion of which vertices should be computed first to achieve an efficient execution. And so in our work, we also looked at introducing priority queues on each machine to manage the prioritization of vertex computation. And so if we introduce a priority queue on CPU1 here, the idea is that we're going to take the vertex which, if we compute on next, will have the most impact towards convergence. So take the highest priority vertex, execute the splash operation at that vertex, and that splash operation will reprioritize our vertices. So it's essentially something like residual belief propagation, for those familiar with it. So reprioritize our vertices, and then execute again. Now, I'd also mention there's a bit of a challenge if we want to distribute this. And so one thing we're doing here is we're essentially assigning priority queues at the processor level and not across the entire distributed environment. But even at the processor level, we actually can get a pretty big gain. So let me illustrate how this actually performs, putting all these pieces together on a real model, or a real synthetic model. So here's a picture of a noisy sunset. I have a picture of a sunset, and I've added noise to it. And I can induce a grid Markov random field on the sunset. And this is going to encode my smoothness prior between pixels, right? And now what I'm going to try to do is run loopy belief propagation to infer the posterior distribution or posterior color of each pixel in this image. And the way I can think about the challenge of this problem is actually determining the pixels along the boundary of the sunset. So if you look at the bottom of the image, it's very easy to infer from your neighborhood that you're likely in the black region. But as you get close to these boundaries, it becomes much harder. Now, if I use this splash primitive on a grid, it doesn't actually look like circles. Splash primitives on grids look like diamonds. So initially, what we'll see is that when the algorithm runs, it's going to uniformly spread these diamonds over the entire picture. And then ideally, through prioritization, it'll focus its computation on the challenging regions. So on the right, I'm going to show a video where bright pixels correspond to things being updated more often, and dark pixels, things less. So initially, we see a uniform covering. So this is executing in parallel. But as the algorithm proceeds, it's going to start to identify the regions of highest residual and focus computation there. Okay. And so as we get to the end, we've seen that the amount of time spent overall on computation was predominantly focused on the challenging regions of the image. Okay, so the algorithm is able to identify and focus on the hidden sequential structure. So one of the key things we've seen so far here, actually let's look at some quick results. So some representative results of the system. We can apply this to real-world problems, so protein interaction models. And if we look at just on a multi-core system as a function of number of processors, the embarrassingly parallel bulk synchronous model, the blue line, and the red line, the splash primitive, even at one processor, the splash algorithm is faster than the bulk synchronous system. And we can also look at the speed up. So if we look at the scaling relative to the fastest serial algorithm, we actually see that the splash algorithm, being the fastest serial algorithm, is still able to scale relatively well. And this is partly due to some improvements in cache efficiency by using these tree primitives. And then finally, if we look at work, and this is something that's very important when designing large-scale systems, is to think about the total work being done in your computation. So as we increase the number of processors, we don't add more work. And in general, the splash primitive allows us to substantially reduce the amount of work required to achieve an accurate answer. In addition, there's some neat side effects that we get faster, more efficient convergence. It converges more often, and we're able to achieve better prediction accuracy. All right, so now if I step back, one of the ideas that sort of became central here is to exploit asynchrony and prioritization to build a more efficient computation. And so now we can sort of look at how that also affects another inference task, Gibbs sampling. So we looked at belief propagation. Now we can think about Gibbs sampling. All right, so Gibbs sampling was introduced in 1984, and it's one of the workhorses of modern Bayesian statistics. And the idea of Gibbs sampling is I'm going to associate random variables, again, with each vertex in my graph, and I'm going to flip these variables at random to estimate a posterior distribution. So we can think of each of these variables as corresponding to a sample of coins, maybe. And then I'm going to sequentially pick a variable from my model, let's say the center vertex. And then I'm going to build the conditional of that vertex based on its neighborhood. So I'm going to look at the neighboring vertices, construct a conditional, and then I'm going to flip that coin with respect to that conditional. And that will generate the next sample in my sequence. So this is a serial algorithm for sampling, and it's pretty powerful in Bayesian statistics. And so we'd like to parallelize this. All right, so one way you could approach this problem is to construct a synchronous Gibbs sampler. This would be the bulk synchronous approach. Right, so I take all of my variables, and I try to assign a processor to each one of them. And then I try to flip them all at once. Right, so it's an embarrassingly parallel process. So it's embarrassingly parallel, but it also converges to the wrong distribution. So it's fast, but wrong. Let me illustrate why it's wrong. So it's actually a very simple illustration. Suppose I just have two variables, and my model says that they're strongly correlated. And I'm going to start out with them having different assignments. So I'm going to start my Markov chain with the top variable white and the bottom variable black. So what happens when I execute this algorithm serially? So top chain here. I'm going to flip the top variable, and with high probability, it's going to try to match the bottom variable. Right? And I repeat this process. Every time I flip a variable, it's going to try to match the other variable. Right? And what I'm going to produce in the end is a sequence of variables which share the same color. So I'll have long sequences of similar colored variables. Now, if I run this in parallel, each variable is going to wake up and try to flip itself and match the other's assignment. And so what I get is this oscillating pattern, where each variable flips to try to match the other. Right? Now, if I look at these two chains, the top chain encodes the strong positive correlation that I had in my model, so it's preserving the model distribution. But the bottom chain has actually the very opposite, strong negative correlation. So it's showing the opposite of what my model is trying to encode. So this is a very simple example of just two variables, and this problem actually can grow to larger models. So essentially, adjacent variables cannot be sampled simultaneously. But of course, this is a pretty well-known result. So in our work, we developed sort of three techniques built around this asynchronous, or these locking and asynchronous primitives to construct convergent versions of this Gibbs sampler that also scale. The first idea is very simple. We use classic ideas from graph coloring to construct a serializable parallel execution. The second technique, we introduce a locking strategy that allows us to essentially lock our Markov blanket and allow asynchronous computation of a Gibbs sampler. And the third result is going to take that splash primitive and essentially build something very similar for Gibbs sampling. So let me quickly go through the chromatic sampler. So the chromatic sampler, I take my graphical model as I had it here. I construct a K coloring of the graphical model. So in this case, it's a two-colorable model. And then I can sample all the variables in the same color in parallel. Right? So I can do this for any Markov random field. I construct the coloring, sample all the variables in the same color in parallel. Now, what's kind of neat about this is I actually can show that this corresponds to a linearization, that they're serial equivalents, that I can take variables of the same color and place them on a chain. And this is equivalent to having executed my serial Gibbs sampler in this pattern. And that's very powerful. It lets me reason about the parallel execution. OK, and that also allows me to describe the following theorem, which is kind of neat. So we can prove that this sampler converges to the correct distribution. And we can, more importantly, quantify the acceleration of mixing. So here we can say that we get an n over p for n variables, p processors, speed up with a k dependence. So my graph coloring essentially describes a serial component of this problem. Okay. And this actually holds for any graphical model, not just chains. So this is a general result. OK, so that gives me one technique to construct a parallel Gibbs sampler. But we can do better. And so by introducing a locking protocol, I can essentially say that vertices adjacent to each other can't run simultaneously. So I can allow the system to enforce this serializability constraint. And doing that, I'm able to now construct an asynchronous version of the splash procedure for Gibbs sampling. So I'm going to illustrate the algorithm here. So I begin with my big grid model. And I'm going to pick a variable from the model at random. And I'm going to grow a spanning tree. And actually, I'm going to grow a very special kind of spanning tree. This is called a V-acyclic spanning tree. Or in general, we're going to grow what's a thin junction tree. So a collection of variables that are connected that I'm going to then be able to sample jointly. And I can do this in parallel, so I can build many trees at once because of this locking protocol. So the system, again, is going to enforce the serializability constraints. Right, so they're separated by a Markov blanket. And I'm going to focus just on the left tree. So if I just focus on the single tree here, I can actually use this tree that I've constructed to draw a joint sample for all the variables in that tree. And the way I do that is I'm going to apply the belief propagation algorithm, which is now exact for this tree, to calibrate it. So I'll pass messages from the boundary to the interior. And then having calibrated the tree, I can do backward sampling. Right? So I'm going to do an asynchronous backward sampling where I sample one variable. And as I go down the tree, I get increasingly more parallelism in my sampling strategy. In addition, I'm allowing myself to build new trees asynchronously as this process proceeds. So we had that primitive, again, taking that splash idea and bringing it to Gibbs sampling. I can now actually use that to build a prioritized version of a Gibbs sampler. So here I have my noisy image on the left. I'm going to introduce a measure of correlation. And so if I do not apply a measure of correlation, I get these regular structures. So these are the breadth-first search spanning trees, or actually breadth-first search thin junction trees. On the right, if I apply adaptivity, I'm allowing my sampler to actually grow to regions in the graph. So it's going to do a block update to regions of strong correlation. So I can combine these ideas, and I can now give some very simple results. So here I'll apply this technique to Markov random fields for Markov logic networks. And so we can compare just the splash sampler I described in the chromatic sampler. And so when I have strong correlation structure, this additional blocking can have a big impact on the convergence of my algorithm. So I could look at likelihood as a function of time. I can get much higher likelihood samples. I can look at mixing across chains. So I can measure of the mixing of my samplers. And finally, I can look at speed up. So these techniques, again, by exploiting this blocking structure, can have slightly better cache efficiency and get pretty good speed up. OK. All right, so in general, we see that this splash technique can outperform sort of chromatic techniques of bulk synchronous setup on strongly correlated models. OK, so I've talked a lot about sort of asynchronous parallel algorithms for graph computation. And now we might ask, how would I implement these algorithms? So when I started my thesis, we basically wrote all these from scratch in MPI and pthreads, and it was a pain. And as we worked through it, we started to realize there's sort of a primitive that we can build on top of. And so I'm going to try to describe that primitive that we built these algorithms on top of. So this is the system we call GraphLab. And so this is answering the questions how we design and, more importantly, implement these graph parallel algorithms for inference. And so we've heard a lot about Hadoop. Hadoop is sort of the go-to system when trying to build large-scale parallel computation, at least in the machine learning community. And the idea that I'm going to process all of my records in parallel, so a data parallel task, and then there's some final aggregation, and I might chain these together to get an iterative algorithm. Right? The reality, though, is graph parallel computation looks different. Right? So I have a graph where each of my vertices are connected. I'm trying to reason about that. And my computation lives at the vertex level and interacts with the neighbors. Right? So if I look at my computational primitive, I'm thinking at the vertex level and how my state changes as a function of my neighborhood. And the parallelism in all these stories emerges from running multiple vertices simultaneously, but not all vertices, subsets. Okay, and so there are two systems that have sort of grown out of this area, at least in the cloud computing world. So Pregel, which was developed by Google, and GraphLab, which was developed as part of my thesis. And so I'm going to talk about GraphLab today. So GraphLab implements what is essentially we call the Graph-Parallel Abstraction, in which the user, the machine learning researcher, for example, defines a program that lives on every single vertex in the graph. So user defines a user-defined vertex program that runs on every single vertex. Okay, so we have billions of vertices. We have the same program running billions of times, essentially. And these programs can interact along edges in the graph. So the interaction of programs is constrained to the adjacency structure of the graph. And systems like Pregel, these programs interact by passing messages to neighboring vertices. Whereas systems like GraphLab, these programs interact through shared state. And actually, I think for machine learning algorithms, this is more powerful because it essentially isolates the user from having to reason about the movement of data. And instead, the user thinks about the state of a vertex in the context of its neighbors, or its Markov blanket if we're designing graphical model inference algorithms. Now, parallelism in this story, again, emerges by running multiple vertices simultaneously. So the GraphLab system with the shared state also had this concept of scheduling. Cool. And so we have this idea effectively of a shared scheduler, although it's actually a distributed primitive, in which each of my CPUs are going to pull the next vertex to process. Because remember, we're not processing all the vertices at once. We're processing a subset. So we take, let's say, vertices A and B. We execute the vertex programs for those vertices on A and B on the physical processors. And those little vertex programs can then trigger future computation. So this is essentially scheduling the neighboring vertex to receive the message I just sent to them. Right? And that neighboring computation then goes back into the scheduler. Right? And we can repeat this process, again, pulling stuff from the scheduler. And here we build a breadth-first search traversal of the graph, again, scheduling these things back. And what's cool is a scheduler allows us to then introduce the concept of priority. Right? So I can change the way my scheduling algorithm works and get very different behaviors for each of my overall algorithms. The other thing that GraphLab does that's pretty unique is it guarantees serializability. Right? So if I'm going to run vertex programs on these three vertices, I can actually do so safely because I know that they don't modify any state that the other vertex can read. But if I try to add a fourth vertex to this model and try to run this program at the same time, it's now no longer consistent. And now the GraphLab's runtime, the actual system, is going to detect these conflicting edges and prevent this execution from occurring. So it's automatically going to maintain serializability. Okay? So we built this system, and as we started to test it on multi-core and then large-scale distributed environments, we ran into an interesting problem, and this was alluded to earlier today, and that is the challenge of parallel graphs. And I want to briefly mention what this is and sort of how we approached it. Right? So parallel graphs are sort of ubiquitous. The real-world graphs we want to reason about for real machine learning computation don't have the regular grid structure I keep drawing in all my illustrations. Instead, they have sort of a star-like motif, where we have, let's say, a high-degree vertex center, maybe it's Barack Obama, and as many followers along the boundary. So they have a small set of high-degree vertices and a very large set of low-degree vertices. And so with GraphLab, one of the things we had to do is figure out how to deal with this vertex skew in a large-scale distributed environment. And one of the things that we did is we actually exploit the abstraction itself. So what we do is we say we have these high-degree vertices. We're actually going to transform the underlying graph, splitting these high-degree vertices and essentially bringing their degree down, and also splitting them across machines, so developing new partitioning techniques that exploit this degree structure. And then the more important and challenging part is we're going to be able to transform the computation. So the user is going to program for the original graph. We're going to have it execute equivalently and efficiently on this transform graph. So this is going to allow us to take programs that are written to live at a vertex and split that program itself across the cluster. And the way we do that is actually pretty straightforward. We're going to exploit a common structure in our algorithms, whether that's belief propagation, PageRank, connected components, Gibbs sampling. All of them have this standard pattern where the program living in each vertex begins by computing some statistic of its neighborhood, whether or not it's the product of the messages or the sum of the ranks of neighboring vertices. So this first operation is a commutative associative operation, and we can exploit that commutative associative structure to transform the graph. Then after we've received this message or the statistics that are neighboring vertices, we update our vertex state. And now this doesn't depend on neighboring vertices, and this is entirely data parallel at the vertex level. And finally, when we compute these messages to neighboring vertices or trigger neighboring vertices for future computation, that operation itself is edge parallel. So again, this is a highly parallel operation. So taking these 3 steps, we can actually split a program apart across the cluster. So I'm actually not going to talk about the design of the system to do that today. I'm just going to talk about some of the results. Okay. So we built that system. It's actually called GraphLab 2, but you can check it out at graphlab.org. It's designed to run in the cloud environment, so it runs on an EC2 cloud. It runs on top of MPI, pthreads, and HDFS. But on top of it, we've also built a wide range of actual machine learning and data mining applications to sort of validate the system, but also to use it to solve real problems. And so one of the first things that everyone does when you build a graph parallel system is you run PageRank. So we too ran PageRank on our system, although it was designed for graphical model inference. And the idea here is we're going to run PageRank on a graph with 40 million users and 1.4 billion links. And so we can look at sort of the published results of other systems today. And then we can look at it in the context of GraphLab. And just using these high-level primitives, we're able to achieve an order of magnitude performance improvement over the current systems for solving this problem. Okay. And this is, again, exploiting natural graph structure. Another thing we could do is maybe a little bit more important is trying to reason about topical distributions of documents, right? So we can apply Gibbs sampling to the LDA model for the Wikipedia data set. And so here we have a data set with 2.6 million documents, 8.3 million words, and 500 million tokens. Okay. So this is a computationally intensive algorithm, and here's sort of what we see. So a system designed at Yahoo for solving this problem, a very optimized system, can achieve actually 150 million tokens per second with 1,000 topics per token. So this is a pretty good result. We built a system, or we implemented this algorithm on top of GraphLab. And so using just 64 machines, we're able to achieve 110 million tokens per second for 1,000 topics. But this is using 200 lines of code, written in just 4 human hours. So this is allowing a high-level engineer or a research scientist or even a machine learning person to build a scalable system, right? And to do it in a short amount of time. Another, and I guess the final task I want to talk about is triangle counting. And so actually, Sergey mentioned this a little bit earlier. So this is work that he had worked on to try to compute the number of triangles in a graph. So this is for every vertex, we're going to compute the number of triangles that vertex is a member of. Okay, so we're going to run this on the Twitter graph. This has 40 million users and 1.4 billion links. So the technique he describes is actually pretty good. This is a technique running on Hadoop, an algorithm that's sort of optimized to exploit the bulk synchronous structure of Hadoop. And so here, using 1,500 machines, we're able to process this problem in 423 minutes. So that's 34.8 billion triangles. Okay? It's actually a pretty big triangle counting task. Okay, 34.8 billion triangles. So GraphLab, with our newest number, on 64 machines can do this in 15 seconds, solving the same problem, counting all 34.8 billion triangles and labeling the motifs. So that's 1,000 times faster. Now, in Sergey's defense, this is actually Python code written in Hadoop running on a provision cluster, and our code is C++ code running on 64 dedicated machines. But actually, when we go and compare this against some of the state-of-the-art serial problems or serial systems for solving this, we're getting almost perfect scaling. So what we've achieved here is we've exploited the adjacency structure and, in fact, reused our neighborhood information to be able to efficiently compute this several orders of magnitude faster than some of the fastest reported results. Okay, so in summary, this idea of GraphLab and GraphLab 2, the systems we built, exploit the common patterns in graph computation, and they allow us to essentially represent real-world graphs in new ways and to exploit that to efficiently execute graph algorithms on top of those, achieving orders of magnitude improvements in performance. So I'll stop there. Any questions? Thank you.